Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Swell, the new executive director. Pardon my phone for ringing. I'm the new executive director of the Peale, Baltimore's Community Museum. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second talk in this year's It's More Than History lecture series, sponsored by the Baltimore National Heritage Area and presented by the Peale. This is the fourth year we've brought this series to people, and we're thrilled to keep it going. Today's event, Baltimore's Billie Holiday and the Birth of Jazz, features a presentation by Professor Lawrence Jackson, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English at Johns Hopkins University, and the director of the Billie Holiday Center for Liberation Arts. Today's online program is being recorded, and the recording and transcript of the discussion will be available after the program on our YouTube channel. Please keep your mics on mute during the program. If you have questions, please add them to the chat at any time, and we'll try to answer sequentially during the question and answer session after the presentation. We'll have an ASL interpreter with us throughout the discussion and chat, as you can see. You can also turn on closed captions in your Zoom toolbar. I'd like you to add that accessibility is a core value at the Peale, so you will find almost all of our online programs have ASL interpretation. So please tell your colleagues and friends our aim is to be accessible to all. The Peale's mission is about amplifying and sharing the voices and stories that too often have been overlooked or intentionally erased from the historical record. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the Peale in Baltimore stands on the traditional ancestral grounds of a number of indigenous peoples, including the Piscataway and the Susquehannock. Our work is ongoing to better understand the pre-colonial history of our city and region, and also to support the indigenous peoples who are part of our communities today. You can pick up our free copy of the Illustrated Guide to East Baltimore's Historic American Indian Reservation Walking Tour Map from the Peale, and also download the Guide to Indigenous Baltimore app for free. I'd like to thank Ryan Coons and the Maryland State Arts Council for the land acknowledgement references they have made available to us, and to local leaders like Ashley Minor Jones for ensuring that Indigenous voices are heard and recognized in Baltimore today. Please go ahead and sign up for our next lecture in this series, The B&O Railroad and the Emerging Nation, on the Peale's website. It's being hosted on Friday, April 25th. I'm really happy to introduce Shantae Daniels, Executive Director of Baltimore National Heritage Area, one of our great partners. Shantae, thank you once again for allowing the Peale to present these compelling, insightful talks in its More Than History Lunchtime Lecture Series. Please take it away, Shantae. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you very, very much for that introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Lawrence Jackson. He is the author of many books, including Chester B. Himes, A Biography, The Indignant Generation, A Narrative of History of African-American Writers and Critics. Second to that is My Father's Name, Black Virginia Family After the Civil War, and Ralph Ellison, Emergence of a Genius. Dr. Jackson's latest books are Hold It's Real Steel, Clint Eastwood, Race and the Cinema of American West, and Shelter, A Black Tale from Homeland, Baltimore. He teaches English and history at Johns Hopkins University and writes occasionally for Harper's Magazine. I will say that I have the pleasure of meeting Dr. Jackson at another lecture that he gave on the community of Sharp Leadenhall and the communities around it. So Dr. Jackson has a full wealth of information and history recording for Baltimore's history. And that's what we are about, is Baltimore National Heritage Area. We are about preserving the history and the culture for the current generations and future generations. So before I turn it over to Dr. Jackson, I wanted to let you know that this is the Women's History or Women's Heritage Month, and that's why we were presenting Billie Holiday and her story of jazz in Baltimore. In addition to Billie Holiday's work, She was also very instrumental in the civil rights movement. And with that, I want to let everybody know that we have these beautiful um, T-shirts that commemorate the civil rights leaders of Baltimore on sale with the Baltimore National Heritage Area. There is, we recognize Billie Holiday, Elijah Cummings, Thurgood Marshall, and of course, excuse me, and of course, Frederick Douglass. So if you are interested in that, there'll be information about the T-shirt, about the Baltimore National Heritage Area, will be listed in the program at the end where you can get those T-shirts, or you can find out more about who we are in our organization. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jackson. Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for being here today.
It's my pleasure to be here today. I'm really looking forward to sharing some new information with everybody, with the community. I have to sort of begin with an apology and a bit of a maybe hopefully only a slight disappointment. The nature of academic research, or maybe just being an academic at a place like Johns Hopkins, is that you have the opportunity to sort of pursue your passion. And I have been pursuing my passion for the last semester. And what has happened is that my research has taken me into new directions. And so I'm actually going to share new research with you today, but maybe not quite as focused on Billie Holiday as some of you might have liked. But I promise you, every chance that we have to talk about the marvelous history and legacy and the rich art of Holiday, we sort of take advantage of that. I ask you to join us at some of our upcoming events at the Baltimore Museum of Art on April the 10th, and then at the Lafayette Square Jazz Concert. I think that the date is September the 7th, where we will have our banners up again and talking about the heritage of Holiday. But today we'll sort of get up to Billie Holiday, but really what I want to talk to you about is the emergence of, I'm using the term Black vernacular musical expression, the emergence of African American music, native music produced by people of African descent, African people, here on the North American mainland, as we've already been reminded, on the lands of the Piscataway and the Susquehannock and the Powhatan, the Algonquin-speaking peoples. Um, we often sort of think about a sort of like a holy place for the emergence of what we call jazz music, and I would just sort of remind everyone that no less a personage as Duke Ellington never used the term jazz, right? He said he said he was a Negro folk musician. That's what he said. He said he was playing Negro folk music. So, you always had a sort of a contested idea about nomenclature and, what was this term going to be? My friend and colleague Jamal Moore, contemporary African American musician here in Baltimore, he says I don't like this word jazz, and sort of it means. But we think about this sort of like this holy place in New Orleans where all of these things come together at once. And what I'm going to talk about today is that I want us to think about Baltimore at the same time and at the same place, and almost sort of decade by decade, and to sort of conduct an important comparison. And of course, because so much of the national history, or well, the regional history of Baltimore and the shape, impact, and influence of people of African descent here is I would just say it's kind of like it's weakly known, or it's diluted, or it's not fully recognized for a host of reasons. I think that we're not doing enough to cultivate a very important heritage and legacy, and Baltimore national heritage kind of thing, right? So that's where we are today, the birth of jazz in Baltimore, and I'm going to try to kind of go through a couple of slides, somewhat quickly and leave us some time for discussions. And I would say, the one thing about this kind of research is that it's still in a sort of a speculative place, and I'm sure there are many people who are listening who have, really great information. Some of the, and I hope that you do share with me some of the most important insights that I have gotten so far that directed the research came from my cousins, Charles and Jennifer Duggar. And years ago, I don't know, years ago, Charlie said to me, he said, "Hey, Larry, the there used to be music on the boats downtown at the harbor or something, right? When I was 12 years old, I used to hand out flyers when the Inner Harbor opened, and hey, here's what's going on at the Inner Harbor. But the idea that there had been something before that time, was like that was very difficult for me to imagine. But it's sort of sparked a curiosity, and lo and behold, there's a strong tradition in Baltimore that I won't mention today, but anyway, of sort of riverboat excursions and bands playing on the riverboats. And then Charlie's wife, Jennifer, cousin Jennifer, she said they live on Barry Street today, and she said Larry Barry Street was always important to Black people. And I know, I only know a little bit now, but very, very little about the world below Pratt Street. And I've had this great fortune to be able to be in, a community that includes Sister Betty Bland Thomas of the Sharp Street Leadenhall Community Organization and the Ebenezer AME Church, where I met Sister Shante Daniels. And it turns out, I mean, of course, our city has been reconstructed, with filling in different parts of the waterways and creating highways, especially, and stadiums that have, sort of recreated the urban terrain and the topography, the lay of the land, and all of that. But it redirected my efforts, and when I had the antenna, alert, I started to notice, and then I would say, sort of speculate about other kinds of things. And then what I'm most interested in is the African American musical culture. And the last thing I say before I try to race through these slides is that, and I do want to thank our sign language folks who are working with us today. It's really wonderful. It's such an incredible skill, and I hope that I'm in good partnership with you as we try to communicate with our audience. The last thing I would say is that learning to dance, or let's say feel comfortable dancing in public. But I belong to like the subgenre or the subworld of house music people, right? The tribal world of house music in Baltimore and other parts of the world, but the United States. But learning to dance was like it was such a major part of my adolescence and young adulthood. But anyway, high school and college especially. And I started noticing dancers in Baltimore, but especially one older man at the Inner Harbor that I used to watch dance and who I actually imitated and shared the imitations with other people. And the acquisition of rhythmic movement. I'm not. I'm always striving to be a more rhythmic person. The acquisition of rhythmic movement and rituals and ceremonies have had like a tangible impact in my own life. And so I've always sort of been curious to think about the past and how these traditions were conveyed. And maybe not in a super technical way, but certainly one with a strong interest in the description. So what you're looking at right now is actually a 1791. Sometimes these drawings. I'm sorry, I forget the technical name of the production of the print. Sometimes they were colored, but you have a whole book that was created devoted to Cap Francois, the north of Haiti, and they often noted the different musical celebrations that were taking place and the kinds of instruments. And so if you notice on the, what is for me, the far right of the screen, you have a person aside, a very large cylindrical drum. And then there's another person who has it's sort of a mandolin looking instrument up to their chin, but they seem to have, two open hands, or one hand closed, left hand closed around the neck, and then an open right hand. And then there's another drummer in the very middle of the scene, and then there are two couples dancing. This is cropped. There's actually a bit more that's going on. You can also see European women and one European man, or two European women and one European man, who are sort of in the back of the scene. There's an umbrella over their head, but this moment of the dance, the kind of celebration, and the music. I mean, obviously, this is it's a pastoral representation of enslavement in Haiti. Uh, French enslavement practices in Haiti are known to be among the most brutal of any enslavement regimes that were ever created by human beings. It's important to remember that in 1790, Haiti accounts for 40% of all of the coffee consumed by Europeans, 60% of all the sugar consumed by Europeans. The coming revolution in Haiti completely devastated the French economy. But in this pastoral portrait, the emphasis on a very precise, clinical, scientific emphasis on Black music and dance, I think it's really useful for us and for our imagination. So to begin with, one of the things that's so fascinating about this work for me is that it's sort of like the idea of New Orleans as the foundation of jazz. It really, in so many important ways or crucial ways, I think, it returns to the figure of Benjamin Latrobe. And I'll show you the passage, sort of on the next page. Maybe we'll just sort of go through that quickly. But Latrobe goes to New Orleans in December of 1818, and he is there for a day and a half, and he walks sort of like, directly to the center of the downtown to what's called Place Publique, and he sees a celebration, African dancing, and he makes a really meticulous record of what he sees. And Latrobe I think is really important American. We know his son, John Hazelhurst Latrobe, I think, who's kind of like raised in Baltimore. He goes to St. Mary's, and then he lives and works here for most of his life, or maybe even the rest of his life. But he is John Hazelhurst Latrobe is the son of really one of like a Benjamin Franklin kind of a figure. I mean, a really, really important architect and engineer in the American early national life. And Latrobe was not a gentleman. In fact, he's always sort of remarking about the way that the planners and the merchants are derisive or disdainful in their interactions with him. Latrobe is an architect and an engineer, a learned man, always seeking more learning and refinement. And obviously he's the key person, in the creation of the Basilica and the Exchange Building, and he's probably, I guess, the major architect for the U.S. Capitol. There are three architects for the U.S. Capitol. But if you look at this segment from his diary that is preserved at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, you can see him actually making a drawing of what he saw in Place Publique in New Orleans in 1818, and the place that comes to us today as Congo Square. And so you have Latrobe with the rendition of Congo Square, which is sort of like bar none, the one that all histories of jazz music, all histories of African music, I mean, everybody returns to this account that he gives, where he says, I heard a most extraordinary noise, which I suppose to proceed from some horse mill, because he's always creating, like these different kinds of mills to not so much, like for grain, but I mean, like he wants to make a mill so that you can work in the quarries, and get the marble for the capital. And he's an engineer, and he's making these steam engines, and so he's always interested in sort of like manufacturing and early industrial processes. One of the early investors with Fulton in the steamships, I mean, he's interested in how things work. The horse is tramping on a wooden floor. I found, however, on emerging from the house to the common, that it proceeded from a crowd of 500 or 600 persons assembled in an open space or public square. I went to the spot and crowded near enough to see the performance. All those who were engaged in the business seemed to be blacks. I did not observe a dozen yellow faces. They were formed into circular groups. In the midst of four, of which I examined, but there were more of them, was a ring, the largest not 10 feet in diameter. In the first were two women dancing. They held each a coarse handkerchief extended by the corners in their hands, and set to each other in a miserably dull and slow figure, hardly moving their feet or bodies. The music consisted of two drums and a stringed instrument. An old man sat astride of a cylindrical drum about a foot in diameter and beat it with incredible quickness with the edge of his hand and fingers. The other drum was an open staved thing held between the knees and beaten in the same manner. They made an incredible noise. The most curious instrument, however, was a stringed instrument, which no doubt was imported from Africa. On the top of the fingerboard was the rude figure of a man in sitting posture, and two pegs behind him to which strings were fastened. The body was a calabash. It was played upon by a very little old man, apparently 80 or 90 years old. The women squalled out a burden to the playing at intervals consisting of two notes, as the Negroes working in our cities respond to the song of their leader. Most of the circles contained the same sort of dances. One was larger, in which a ring of a dozen women walked by way of dancing round the music in the center, but the instruments were of different construction. One, which from the color of wood seemed new, consisted of a block cut into something of the form of a cricket bat, with a long and deep mortise down the center. He's describing something like a xylophone, or what they call a marimba. This thing made a considerable noise, being beaten lustily on the side by a short stick. In the same orchestra was a square drum looking like a stool, which made an abominable loud noise, also a calabash with a round hole in it, the whole studded with brass nails, which was beaten by a woman with two short sticks. A man sung an uncouth song to the dancing, which I suppose was some African language, for it was not French, and the women screamed a detestable burden on one single note. The allowed amusements of Sunday, it seems, have perpetuated here those of Africa among its former inhabitants. I have never seen anything more brutally savage and at the same time dull and stupid than this whole exhibition. Continuing my walk about a mile along the canal, returning after sunset near the same spot, the noise was still heard. There was not the least disorder among the crowd, nor do I learn on inquiry that these weekly meetings of the Negroes have produced any mischief. Now, there are a couple of things that, just for our purposes today, you might, take note of. I'm not an ethnomusicologist or a real expert in, sort of the deep history of musical instruments and musical sound. But I want us to think about some of the social aspects, and we'll be making these comparisons to Baltimore. So Latrobe's recognition, like, for example, about what seems to him skin color and the way that he is noting African Americans in cities and Black people that he worked with would be significant. Latrobe, as I have on the other slide, right, he is actually living in Baltimore from the end of 1817 or early 1818. He moved to Baltimore, he went bankrupt, and he's living on Lexington Street at Pine Street at the far west of the city. His sons go to St. Mary's Seminary. I don't know if he walked, he was excited about them being able to be day students, like he didn't have to pay for them to board. And somebody from his household is walking them to school day to day. This geography in West Baltimore I will return to, but his assessment that it's like it's a dark skinned group of people of African descent or African people here. gives us a sense of some of the things that he might have been more familiar with in the Chesapeake region where he spent most of his working life. Something else to notice, I think, is that he's talking about the way that it does not seem to him to be like refined music, intellectual music, complex music. And this is going to be I think, a really important feature of, sort of whatever it is I'm able to, the conclusions I'll reach, either that, we're effectively producing a very, very similar kind of dance music for African American enjoyment in Baltimore on par with what's taking place in Louisiana, or that there are some really, really important differences. And we will find it will not just be the the Benjamin Latrobes of the world who would be making this assessment about African American vernacular musical expression, that actually we will have a similar assessment from educated African Americans themselves. So, there will be a sharp kind of contrast between high culture and low culture, particularly as the nation state evolves in the early 19th century. So the project in one way is called like In Search of Kufi Square. And, we have this, I think it's a remarkable map of Baltimore from 1851. And then, I'm sure everybody knows like where I grabbed this picture, that's Charles Street, on the going up the hill towards the Washington Monument. It's like one of the really wonderful galleries that you see on the facade of one of our townhomes, again, like you would see in New Orleans. So before I sort of lay out my argument or try to wow you with the evidence, I just want to say a few words about some of the reasons why, like, especially if it's a new idea to you, that like jazz could have had, or Black musical expression could have had, an independent origin here in Baltimore. Why it might seem like an unusual idea, I would say it really does have to do with a profound split between high and low culture, that is in some ways quite characteristic in Western society, but especially one that might be connected with some of our important historical figures. And as you might imagine, so many of them have a really, really deliberate and tangible tie with Baltimore. So Frederick Douglass is, ultimately going to wind up being like Mr. High Culture. And that's an overstatement, but for our purposes, he'll stand at one end of the pole. Frederick Douglass, is supposed to be like the person without peer, it's like autodidact, self-taught, is always recognized as being, sort of the extraordinary individual in his group or in his environment, in his circumstance. Douglass learns to play the violin while enslaved here in Baltimore City, and I really am admiring of Ed Papenfuss's work and argument, but that you have like an elite society or social circle that Douglass at least somewhat, participates in as a 19-year-old or a 20-year-old here in Baltimore, that is doing things like encouraging I mean, it must have been the ability to read music and play the violin. I mean, he does go on to become a polished violinist, but I'm not talking so much about like a vernacular hoedown, or what they used to call the Negro ball, but something that you would do in the parlor, in the salon. On the other side of this debate, or not quite, but somewhat, would be Martin Delany, who was he's the first Black officer in the military. He's admitted to Harvard University for medical college, and he writes for the North Star. One of our important figures. But Delany is going to be, he's born free, unlike Douglass. But Delany is going to be like, I believe in my ancestry, and my Black ancestry is like, that's the most, my African ancestry is the most important thing that I have going for me. And my dad is from, or it might be his grandparents, right? One side of my family is from Angola, and the other side of my family is Mandinga from, Gambia River, Niger River in the Guinea Highlands, right? And I am doing everything, in my power to, live up to that ancestral heritage. And Delaney will ultimately, in 1860, or I guess he goes in 1859, he will lead an expedition up the Niger River, modern day Nigeria, going up through the Hausa lands, maybe a little bit of Niger, I guess, to, through like to going towards Mali, but I think everything he does is pretty much in northern Nigeria. And it's like, hey, I'm going to find ancestral land, and I'm going to, begin another kind of a colonization effort back to Africa. And so you could sort of see the emergence of a split. Douglas used to say some people are thank God that they were made human beings, and Delaney thanks God that he was made an African human being, right? You can see some tendencies towards like a acculturation with moving in the direction of Western high culture and a sense of the power, significance, and importance of African cultural products, whether it's a survival, whether it's something that you learn and celebrate and do in an African way, that these would be really, really important. Coming into the 20th century, Zora Hurston, who of course graduates from high school here in Baltimore at Morgan, will be one of the key people who would be um, acknowledging and celebrating the significance of folk expression. She's not alone, but she would be maybe the most important person, and she has published work that we can turn to, who would say, well, we need to go and visit the folk and collect the stories and the tales and the songs and the dances with all of the means at our disposal, and to preserve them. And we perhaps should be reluctant to disturb them or to process them over much. Zora Hurston always will have this famous argument with people like it's not William Grant Still, it's another one of the celebrated choir directors, where she would be like, you're taking the spirituals and then you're over orchestrating them, and you're ruining the what the work of art is supposed to be about or do. The arguments that we have today about the significance of a lot of these residue parts of African life and culture, really driven home by two 20th century linguist, anthropologist, Lorenzo Dow Turner, who made the argument about the African survivals in the coastal South Carolina Sea Island, it's like archipelago along South Carolina and Georgia, where you had enslaved people more or less left alone with very, very few whites in positions of even as supervisors, but who would have more rigidly reinforced English speaking patterns, English cultural patterns. And at the end of the Civil War, or actually very early in the Civil War, when the Union takes over that island chain, people started to collect the songs that they heard there. And, a lot of people were really taken with the fact that, this seems to be like the original Black culture that was created by, sort of the first Africans that arrived in the United States. But I just want to emphasize that this linguist, Lorenzo Dow Turner, is one of the earliest people to notice the significance of different kinds of words from Congo, different languages in the Congo, excuse me, and starts to do some preservation work, and then maybe a more total argument about African American people is made by Melville Herskovits, that really, sort of carries forward into our own period, right? Even though it's almost 100 years old, or it comes out in the 1930s, into the 1930s. But certainly, this would be the academic work that would be inspiring Leroy Jones, as he's writing, Blues People, and as folks from also people like Catherine Dunham, but as folks in the 1960s begin the Black Arts Movement. The rejection, or the sensibility that there are very, very few Africanisms among North American Black people, whether it's cuisine, language, dance, or music, it really does. It gets boiled down, or it gets emphasized in its most succinct way, perhaps, with the Baltimorean E. Franklin Frazier. And I don't know if we think so much about Frazier and his the 18 years, that he lives here in Baltimore City. Um, but Frazier would write at the same time that Herskovits is, sort of making a really, really elaborate argument about a continuum between, whoever is coming from, West Africa and Central Africa to the Western Hemisphere, to the Atlantic world, and that they were successful in passing down to, multiple generations, some dimensions of a culture that could be recognizable, or might be recognizably African. Uh, it really, would be like in the Negro family in the United States. And Frazier writes, the isolated instances, they tend to show how difficult it was for slaves who retained a memory of their African background to find a congenial milieu in which to perpetuate the old way of life. Even before reaching the United States, slaves have been subjected to influences that tended to destroy the significance and meaning of their African heritage. Now, that point of view, like, is important for a place like Baltimore, where you have 1860, but as early as 1820. So for in the 19th century, right? Everybody pretty much is kind of convinced, with the exception of a couple large planners. I mean, I guess this would be the South Carolinians, right after the Revolutionary War. Everybody is like, it's going to be the same kind of gradual manumission that you see in the northern states, and slavery will more or less, sort of be ended by the 19th century. And then it is the explosion of the cotton commerce that takes chattel slavery to the West and forward, and the settlement, or European settlement, of the rest of the continental United States, and sort of the bringing into the different states of the Union, slave states, free states, really, because of this commerce in the new national economic fortune. But it's interesting if you think of this person from Baltimore, sort of insisting on the inaccess, or the inability that someone would have, because Baltimore, between 1820 and 1860 is the home of the largest concentration of freed people in urban America, right? So you're just nonstop seeing all of these African Americans who are like making their own decisions about where they work and who they live with, and what their lives are going to be about. Part of the pressure by the time Frazier is writing, and I mean, this is it's very, very contemporary. I mean, I know that I'm getting older, and everything, the time, your perspective on time changes, but it's such a contemporary moment, especially relative to music. Jonathan Hayward is going through the music of Duke Ellington in the next week, and so the Baltimore Symphony is looking at it, and of course, the 1930s and the 1940s is like, it's a great moment of so much of the remarkable music of Duke Ellington. But when Frazier is coming into his sense of Black culture, it is really, really at a moment in the early or the late 1910s, early 1920s, when you just can't get away from this sense that jazz music is some kind of atavistic return to primitive tribalism. And, so 1924, have this, this little thing, you've got Vogue magazine. They're like, this is, you listen to these jazz musicians in New York, and this is like the moonlight in an African jungle. In the Afro-American newspaper, you have them writing, this music, it's imported from Haiti and Cuba, supposed to have originated in West Africa. The savage medicine man is thought to have goaded his tribe to frenzy by the use of it. It reached New Orleans and survived there in the underworld resorts. And then it went from the Mississippi to Chicago, and it went out, became popular. And it's these inventors of this new music, new things to know that the most popular music of the day is centuries old, and at the bottom, it is nothing more than the wild, syncopated boompa of a drum of the African wild man, right? This is sort of, this is coming from the African American middle class. I grew up in the St. James Church, and George Freeman Bragg, he uses his early newspaper to create the Afro. And, these are folks who, if they had their power, would have scattered, this music into 1,000 pieces and thrown it into the wind. And one thing that we should remember with Frazier, I'm sorry, I apologize for this picture. So Frazier is growing up at 511 St. Paul Street throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He's born in 1894. But it's basically Center Street and St. Paul Street. And so Frazier is precisely the person who actually lives through the creation and the building of Preston Gardens, like where modern day Mercy Hospital is. Just on the other side of you guys who were at the Peale, or if anybody's down at the Peale today. But this is sort of one of the earliest examples. It's an eminent domain by Mayor Preston. Where he basically forced out. I haven't looked at the deed records or anything to see if the city, how much money city gave people, but it is the kind of like the forced removal of a huge African American neighborhood that's right on the other side of City Hall and the courthouse. And this is really what begins the great movement up, Druid Hill Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue. To what used to be that was the northwest of Baltimore at the time. But so Frazier himself, has to make an adjustment in his own family life, because he's got younger siblings. But as this sort of massive relocation of African Americans occurs, and I'll get back to that one again. But anyway, those are some of the dimensions or elements that have shaped how we think about, what we might know or what's possible. And in what I'm looking for, I'm calling it not Congo Square, but Cuffy Square. Cuffy is it's sort of like the transliteration of the Akan day name Kofi for Friday. If you're a male child born on Friday, you're called Kofi. And for any number of reasons, in the Chesapeake especially, the 2 day names, Kofi for Friday and Cujo for Thursday, they wind up being picked up and becoming like, catch-all terms for a Black person, Cuffy, sometimes Cuffee. But it is also evidence of a certain kind of an acculturation process that takes place in Maryland and Virginia in the 17th century, and by the 18th century is quite profound. On this 1851 Sydney and Neff map, and I've spent a lot of time just sort of poring over a couple of maps from the 19th century, first half of the 19th century. But on this map, if you could pay really, look really, really sharply, hey, I may help you. You'll notice that here at Ridgely and West Street, you have the Potter's Field, And then they have designated by 1851 that there's a little part that's the African cemetery on Ridgely and West. So there's like it's some kind of a sub shop there today. This is almost directly across the street from M&T Bank Stadium. Um, but the place where the funeral rites of destitute African Americans would have been performed, because this cemetery is it's chartered in 1793. I think that it winds up being hugely significant if we're looking for a place that would be similar to or in the same region as a Congo Square. And I've spent a little bit of time looking at like some of the import patterns from West Africa. You have like a lot of English ships going from Liverpool to the port called St. Louis at the Senegal River, and then also at the Gambia River. In some ways, like very much the Kunta Kinte story, the Alex Haley story about his Mandinga ancestors coming from the Gambia River in the 18th century to Annapolis. And what I find particularly important or really want to focus on, it sort of goes into, well, or I'm spending a little bit of time on two areas. So on the one hand, these people from Senegambia, like I've done some DNA testing, right? This would be like like a very common kind of answer. But anyway, I too would have distant ancestors from this region of West Africa. Um, the Mandinga and the Bambara, the Serer, the Susu, the Wolof, the Fulani, I would say it's probably mainly, or it seems to me like it's mainly the Bambara are the people who were trafficked most successfully by other groups at different times. And then some groups are kind of like they lose the war and they're wiped out, and very many of them are transported. But that this and the musical traditions of these groups are going to wind up being especially significant in Maryland. I mean, I think as you should know, or I hope you know, or maybe you've been thinking about, the other major parts of Western Africa and Central Africa that bring captives to the Chesapeake, we're talking about maybe 80,000, 87,000 people, something like that in the course of transatlantic slave trade. So like really from the mid 17th century until about 1762 here in Maryland. You also have large numbers of people who are being brought from what is thought of by the European sailors as the Bight of Biafra, the Igbo lands of the Delta lands of southeastern Nigeria. And then it's a very large territory, it's basically thought of as almost Congo Angola. But in Maryland, like coming from the Congo region, you only have like a handful of boats, but you have 400 or 500 people at a time being brought. And when the anthropologists look at the way cultural traditions are sustained and passed over, they say the most important thing is that you have like a kind of a steady, usually if a boat is coming from the Gambia, it'll be like 80 people, 100 people, but that you have a steady return of people from a similar cultural tradition or region. And that even if you brought large numbers of people at one time, it would be more difficult, to sort of keep that going over the decades and the centuries. And the other really important group, of course, I mentioned the day names, would also be the Akan people, who don't come in huge numbers at any one time, but come steadily over the decades. And this is a English preference for people from what they call the Gold Coast of West Africa. But anyway, modern day Ghana and in some ways also parts of Togo and Benin. And what I'm trying to figure out or to think about is like where people are winding up having concentrations of enslaved and free people in early Baltimore, where there might have been open spaces, possibilities for expression, less supervision, And it keeps leading me to this cove area and to the brickyards around the water's edge. Like the most famous representation that we have of early, or the earliest representation that we have in, what becomes the United States, British North America, is this 1790 painting attributed to a South Carolina planter. And in it, you can see very clearly the banjo as an instrument, the same one described by Latrobe, and then also someone with two sticks, in a beat in a gourd as a percussive kind of an instrument. There are a number of instruments, one of them called the quaqua, that involves, sort of keeping a rhythm with it. You have the women with handkerchiefs. You have a man dancing with a stick. Stick dances are important and ubiquitous. But I just emphasize, for the for the sake of our very much faster paced talk soon to come, but I just emphasize that this is at the bottom of the screen is the earliest banjo that's been recovered. It's from 1770. And then in the middle of the screen is a Gambia River akonting. And that's for the most part, it's an instrument played by people. They call people the Jula people. I lived in West Africa for a year in 2013, 2014. Jula is a trade language, like Swahili is a trade language. And so all over West Africa, like if you're a merchant or something, and often if you're a Mandinga person or Bambara person, you speak Jula as another kind of language. But you can see very much or very easily that this is a tradition that it absolutely is brought over. And I would encourage us to think about, or I'm trying to think about as much as I can, that it seems, or there certainly is strong logic for it to have appeared in the Chesapeake first, or to have had an especially powerful evidence in the Chesapeake. And probably the best description that you get prior to Latrobe of Black musical performance is by a young Englishman who is at Nanjemoy, and sort of the pattern, there is one ship that comes directly from Gambia River to Nanjemoy in the mid 18th century. But if you were at Nanjemoy or Port Tobacco, sort of on the northern side, or maybe it'd be like the eastern side of the Potomac River on the Maryland side, that's the sort of tributary to join this other community up the Patuxent River. And modern day Prince George's County or Upper Marlboro and Lower Marlboro were important places then. But Cresswell, it's fascinating when Cresswell sees this account. I don't have time to read it, but he sees the dancing, he hears the music. He goes, like, in a couple of days, he crosses the Patuxent and he goes to Annapolis. He does not come to Baltimore because in 1774 there is no Baltimore, right? There's no point for having a series of tobacco warehouses here at that time. But it shows you also this route, where you have really, really large enslaved communities in the South, and the movement north up to the city. Another fascinating feature of early vernacular musical expression, or its ways that it's impacted, would be the 500 people of Haitian descent, Black people of Haitian descent, who come at once. And remember what I was saying, like in the process of transmitting culture, it's better if a few people come steadily over time. But it seems impossible to me that if you have in 1793 there are 1,500 people of African descent in Baltimore, and in 2 weeks that number increases by 35%. Now, not everybody stays here in Baltimore. Sometimes people wind up going to Cecil County, they wind up going to Frederick County, but there certainly were many opportunities and evidence of the impact of so many Haitians coming in the fall of Cap Francois in the summer of 1793, and maybe there'll be more to do about that. And there's a I think I have it with the earlier slide, but I don't want to go back. But on the western side of it's Baltimore County, on the western side of the city at the beginning of the 19th century, it's where the expatriates, the white planters, it's where they go, and they sort of staggered their farms or their farm. I assumed that the land was very cheap, but if you found the people who owned the people who fled Saint Domingue, the white slave owners, if you wanted to find people who had like who owned, say, 7 or 8 people, they would all be in this cluster on the west side of Baltimore, not far from the Sepulchians, Saint Mary's College and Seminary. I mean, or
Dr.
maybe that's
Jackson,
unsurprising, but
Dr.
it's
Jackson, I got a 2 minute warning for you. We're
okay,
running.
great. I'm moving on, moving on. But
Yeah.
one of the things that's fascinating about that point is that we also know that even if you don't have the opportunity for sort of this like reinfusion of people who have mastered a cultural tradition, if you're in clusters and you can go sort of from like one farmer's land to the other farmer's land, when someone gets married, someone dies, someone's born, when it's Easter, when it's Christmas, when it's the Ascension holiday, then often, especially musical traditions, will be preserved. I'm really focusing on South Baltimore. We want to remember these two figures, or there are two great figures that come like specifically from this area who have a lot to do with the preservation of Black culture. Helmsy Nichols and Harlem Renaissance fame, Earl Snakehips Tucker, right? They're like both from the same section of the city. The powerful Black church that has thousands of members in its congregations may have been a force that would have worked against African American cultural expression or common expression. You have the AME minister in Baltimore, trying to wipe it out. However, and befitting Women's History Month, Daniel Payne is assaulted at the altar of the church for attempting to eliminate what he called, the cornfield ditties and the extravagances of worship. So culture is defended here in Baltimore. And in the era of the Civil War, after the Civil War, really begins to expand and break out. And I think that these institutions, they're moving around. This is Frazier's neighborhood up here, the Bethel Church, the St. James Church, the Union Baptist Church, the Douglas Institute. City Hall is right here. I guess their Peale Museum is right here. That's where you're going to have, one of your early African-American high schools. And then this is around, like where Frazier would be, sort of up at the top of the map. But this is a hugely important section of the city, along with the South Baltimore expression, and would lead to the great kind of exodus up Center Street to Howard Street and Utah Street and Paca Street, and then the launching of sort of like what we would recognize as like the syncopated orchestra of the early 1910s, and then it's in 1917 that the Afro, will start proclaiming, hey, we've got these different jazz bands, or people are using jazz as a sort of a marketing thing. But the last point that I have a chance to make today is to think of the two figures. So there's Billie Holiday's dad, Clarence Holiday, and there's Billie Holiday's godfather, Elmer Snowden. So these are major musicians. Clarence Holiday plays guitar for McKinney's Cotton Pickers, which also includes like parts of the Andy Kirk band. And then he plays for Fletcher Henderson. Those are the swingingest. They're more swinging than Duke Ellington's orchestra in the 1920s and in the 1930s, or first section of the 30s. Those are like the most rhythmically driven of all the jazz orchestras, who are creating what becomes, sort of modern dance and swing music. Though Henderson would bring in Louis Armstrong, like it'll be different from what Joe Oliver and Louis Armstrong are doing, sort of in the smaller combinations. But we've got to do more to bring these Baltimore musicians who go out into the world and take it on, but to understand how they're being produced. And both Clarence Holiday and Elmer Snowden are playing in Doc Sims' band in Old Town. They are learning the Elmer
Are running
Snowden
out
is
of
the great.
time.
Okay,
Yeah.
Elmer Snowden is learning. He's
Yeah,
the
I got a
great
question
banjo.
for you real quick here. Is the research published yet?
No, it's
Okay,
not.
not published yet. Let me
Learning,
just
he's the
close
great
real quick.
banjo player. So we have somebody that takes us all the way back to the beginning and the creation of the banjo and African American vernacular expression. But let's finish with a picture of Billie Holiday. Thank you very much. Yeah, love to
Thank
get
you.
questions from you.
Thank you so much for attending the Peele's online program. Don't forget to check our website at thepeale.org for info on the next More Than History lecture on April 25th. And if you enjoyed this program, please join our mailing list and consider making a donation to the Baltimore National Heritage Area to support the cost of this and future lunchtime lectures. You can do that on the BNHA website, explorebaltimore.org. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate your time. I'm so sorry we ran short. It was a fascinating topic, and I look forward to a more extended version of this. We look forward to your published research as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Dr. Lawrence, this was so interesting. We have to meet as we plan to because this is a direct connection here in South Baltimore.
It always is.
Yeah, I guess I will give you a call.
Okay.